It's that I will not do it justice, but we'll try. So we're going to have a little commercial right now. As Nicole said, Family VBS is coming up, and it is June 21st through 23rd. That's a Tuesday through Thursday. We try not to interfere with any weekend trips that you might have. And today's sermon is the adult version. That sounds bad. The grown-up version of the VBS theme. And the theme is Journey to the Unseen World. It's going to have kind of an explorer, Indiana Jones, Dr. Livingstone's type vibe. And you and your family, I invite you to be a part of that. It's a whole family event. If you come, like Nicole said, your family will be paired with one or two other families, and you'll take this journey together. You know, this isn't vacation babysitting, and that model is fine, and it's good. We've done it before. In all honesty, we'll probably do it again at some point. But parents, I just know that one thing you don't lack is places to drive your children and drop them off. But what families do have a deficit in is activities to do together, time journeying through God's Word together, and time as parents for you to form friendships with other adults. And so that's part of what we're offering. And, you know, I'm going to be up here for the better part of the next 2 hours, so you might as well just pull out your phone and register your family right now. You can just go to our website, summitchurchboise.org. The link is right there on the homepage, and go ahead and register your family now. Seriously, it's not going to offend me if you do that or go out and get food. You know, meeting with God doesn't take place here, just like we prayed about. It takes place here. So it won't offend me if you do that. And grandparents, you are also invited to do this with your grandkids. So Hebrews 11, we're going to look at verses 8 through 10 and 13 through 16 today. And I'm going to go ahead and read that, and then we'll go through the passage again in more depth. By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he left, not knowing where he was going. By faith, he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, fellow heirs of the same promise. For he was looking for the city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God. And then skipping to 13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen them and welcomed them from a distance, having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of that country which they had left, they would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Today, as we journey through this passage, you know, we're obviously going to be looking at Abraham and this journey that he took in life. And we're going to go back through the passage and just make some observations on it, and then we will do some application and more general observations after that. When I was a kid, we went to a lot of national parks and state parks, and my youngest sister, who's about 8 years younger than me, always loved to pretend to be the ranger as we'd go along on the trail and be a little tour guide, pointing out things as we went. And, you know, I'd ask like the dumbest questions I could think of just to tease her because I was an older teenage brother. But hopefully none of you will do that to me today as I sum up here. But that's what I'm going to do as we go back through the passage, just kind of point some things out. So Hebrews 11:8, by faith, Abraham. I want to stop there already. The writer of Hebrews, and here's some extra Bible knowledge that this is a really smart church, so a lot of you probably already know this, but we don't actually know who wrote Hebrews. But the writer of Hebrews has a very specific definition of faith, and it's found in this very chapter, in chapter 11. And it comes from verse 1. And it says, "Now faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen." And on the word proof, we've got this footnote that basically says another plausible translation of proof of is conviction about. And I'm going to go with that one because I'm dumb, and that's the one I can wrap my mind around. So basically it's saying that faith is the certainty of things hoped for and a conviction about things not seen. So in Hebrews 11:8, when we read about the faith of Abraham and his family, we are reading about his certainty that he would receive God's promises, his conviction that God would fulfill those promises. It says, "By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed, going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance." So as Abraham is called by God, God speaks to Abraham, and I want to read some of that from Genesis 12, when God is speaking to Abraham. God says to him, "Go from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you." And skipping ahead in Genesis 12, so Abraham went away as the Lord had spoken to him. So Abraham gets this call from God to leave his homeland and go to a place where God will show him. Again, picking up in verse 8 of Hebrews 11, "By faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. And he left, not knowing where he was going." Now, this has already happened by our point in history, so we know where he went. But he went to the land of Israel. And of course, it wasn't called that at that point. It was called the land of Canaan. But that's the area where God is calling him to go. Obviously, Abraham is going to a physical destination, but it is remarkable faith because he goes from the known world, his seen world, to an unseen world, a place he has never been, a place that God will show him. And this makes Abraham a person of great faith. So Abraham goes from where he lives, which is called Ur, to the land of Canaan. Picking up in verse 9, "By faith he lived as a stranger in the land of promise, in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, his son and grandson, fellow heirs of the same promise." Now I want to jump back again to Genesis for just a minute. In Genesis 15, reading from there, "The Lord made a covenant with Abraham. To your descendants I have given this land from the river of Egypt as far as the great river, the river Euphrates." And then, picking up in 17, "And I will give to you and your descendants the land which you live as a stranger, all the land of Canaan, as an everlasting possession, and I will be their God." When Abraham travels to the land of Canaan, this land is supposed to be his, but Abraham does not come in and say, God has given me this land, it's mine now. No, he lives as a stranger and as an exile there. In fact, by his own words in Genesis 23, Abraham, when he's speaking to some of the inhabitants there, says, "I am a stranger and a foreign resident among you." And he has this nomadic lifestyle, living in tents, never settling down, never really acting like the land is his, never having roots there, even though God has promised him this land as his. Picking up in verse 10, it says, "For he was looking for a city which has foundations, whose architect and builder is God." There's a contrast there, by the way, between the transitory nature of living in tents and that city that has foundations. Now you may say, maybe he was living as a nomad because, he was out there looking for the city. He was out searching for it. He's exploring. And that'd be really great because it'd go super well with my VBS theme. But when we look at the Greek word, it actually means it more in terms of he was looking forward to or awaiting or expecting. He's got his sights set on the horizon. So that's verses 8 through 10, and now jumping over to verse 13. All these, that is, the people mentioned so far in the chapter, especially Abraham and his family, all these died in faith. They died still believing. They believed that God would give them the promises. So again, from 13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises. Now remember, we started out by saying that faith is a conviction about things that we have not seen, a certainty of things hoped for. Now, over the course of time, it became so real to Abraham and his family that they were going to realize these promises, that it was if they had seen them off in the horizon, off in the distance. It says here, again, picking up in 13, all these died in faith without receiving the promises, but having seen and welcomed them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They lived in Ur, they lived in Canaan. In both places, they were exiles and strangers, because it was on earth that they were strangers and exiles. Verse 14, for those who say such thing make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. Now you know that I came from California, and I would still say that California is where I am from. I live here in Idaho as an exile, as a stranger. And I got pulled over recently downtown. I don't know the streets very well down there, and I was going the wrong way on a one-way street. It was just a really short street, but I still got pulled over on it. And the cop asked me, "Are you from around here?" And I had to think about it, and he gave me pause. You know, next weekend actually will be the 7th anniversary of me moving here. Since I've moved here, I've gotten a job here. I've met and married Rachel here. I bought a house here, got a dog here. I've had 3 kids here. I'm kind of from here just a little now, but it still gives me pause when I'm asked that, and I get it. So we might think that they are living as strangers and exiles in Canaan because they felt that Ur was their home. And anticipating that we might feel that way, the writer of Hebrews says in verse 15, and indeed they have been thinking about the country from which they had left. They would have had the opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Indeed, as we've said, they were strangers and exiles on the earth. They lived as if heaven was their home. Canaan was not their destination. It was only the destination on earth. Their ultimate destination was that heavenly home. And so, wrapping up our time in the text, it says, therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, but he has prepared a city for them. Now, God was called the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. That's a common moniker for him in the Old Testament. So God is literally the God of these people. That's God, the name he was known by. But he's also the God of all those who have faith. If we have faith, God is not ashamed to be called our God. And this city that he talks about is identified in the next chapter, Hebrews 12 and verse 22, as the heavenly Jerusalem. It's heaven pictured as a city. It's a permanent place for us to live, the place where we are home. Now, it's really easy to say that we should live not for earth, but for heaven. That the earth is not our home, but that heaven is. It's really easy to say that we should live for that unseen world. But it's a hard thing to do. At least it's hard for me to do. Somehow I always end up picking passages that are more about me, that I need more than anybody else. And so if you think this morning that I am talking about you, it's like the old song says, you're so vain. This sermon isn't about you, it's about me. I'm talking about me here, even though I'm going to use we and you and all the rest throughout this sermon. How do we live for this unseen world? I think this series that we just came off of, that Pastor Brian did, is really super important, of knowing who we are and who God has made us to be. And at the beginning of that series, Brian talked about something that I had said to him that I stole from somewhere else about, God tells us that we are God's special creation, that we're made in His image. We're His representatives here on earth. We reflect what He is like. God tells us who we are, but it's like we have amnesia. He tells us that we are made in His image, that we are valuable, that we are special, loved, that we are made to do what is right. And when we choose to do what God has for us, things go better in life. That's how we thrive. But it's hard to accept that. It's hard to accept what God says about who we are and what we need, because sin has skewed the way we look at the world. We may have a sense of, that sort of sounds right, that I'm made in God's image, but it's really is like we have amnesia, where that's almost just a faint memory that we're trying to revive. God is telling us this who we are and what we need in life to thrive. And it's like, I don't know. Maybe that sort of sounds right, but maybe not. We've forgotten who we are. We've become disconnected from reality in that way. We live so much in this seen world, that the seen world envelops us so completely. It's so thick around us that it's difficult to remember that unseen world. It's so difficult to remember that we are chasing promises not yet actualized, not yet seen nor realized. It's difficult to remember that we should have our gaze fixed out on the horizon, that distant horizon. When I first entered college, I went to a community college. And I didn't like the community college very much because, ironically, there wasn't much community there. It was just a bunch of people who were trying to figure out, ironically enough, who they were. They'd get stuck there, and they'd get stuck there for like 7 years for some of them. And I just didn't like it, and that's good because it meant I just spent all my time in the library studying. But I started looking at other colleges, and when I found Biola University, the place where I went, I felt that this is where God was calling me to go. And then I spent the rest of my time at the community college with that in mind. I took the classes that I needed to take so that I could get to that distant horizon, and I studied hard so I could get there. With God's help, I got straight A's, so I get the highest level of academic scholarship to go to Biola, because Biola is super expensive, and those days were tough and difficult. But I remembered that was the place I was going, and that was the reality that I lived by. I lived as a student of Biola even when I wasn't. It reminds me of the words of Jesus from the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 6. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, where thieves break in and steal, but store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." If the things we value are in heaven, it'll be easier to keep that mindset of living as strangers and exiles on the earth. Living for the blessings of heaven, living as citizens of heaven, living as ambassadors in this world, living by that heavenly standard, the standard which we thrive, living according to the image of God that is in us, the reality, the actual reality that exists. God made us to be like Him, and when we do what He says, we thrive in life. We listen to Him saying, "I know who you are, I know what you need, I know what you should do. Let me breathe life into you again. And trust me when I say, I know who you are. You may have amnesia, but I know who you are. And I know what's best for you." And it's so hard to live in that actual reality. Josh and we were cleaning out the family department closet recently downstairs, and I came across this old box of Reese's cereal. If you haven't kept up with Reese's cereal, they've made that Reese's candy into a cereal because there's not enough sugar out there already to put in your face at breakfast. But they had on this box the thing that we need, and it was a really old box, so I don't think you could find it now. But this box provided what you need, and I've got it here with me on my little shelf. You may have heard of virtual reality, but it had actual reality glasses that you could make, and I've made them here, and I'll try not to knock off my microphone. But the box described this with the marketing slogan, it's just like real life because it actually is. and this is what we need. I put these on, and I can see what's really out there. You know, I can look and say, oh, God made me to be like him. Therefore, if I act like him, I'll thrive. Oh, I'm only going to be on earth for a short time. I should live for that heavenly realm instead because that's a much longer time. You know, it's so hard to see because we don't, it's so hard to see actual reality because we don't have these glasses. At least you don't. I have them now. But you know, my kids are always touching my actual glasses, so I'm constantly going around in this fog of thumbprints and other fingerprints, and it's just like the way sin skews our vision, so that when I actually clean these things, it's amazing how much I can see with them. It really is. I should clean them more often. So know who you are. Value the heavenly things by looking. Value the heavenly things and look at the actual reality of life. And remember, you know, as we are anticipating that unseen world, as we're journeying to it, along the way, we're fighting. And sometimes the sad thing is we're fighting ourselves, and that's bad, and that's not what I mean. What I mean is we're fighting part of us that wants to sin, that part of us that likes sin, that part of us that wants to do the wrong thing. That's why the Bible tells us to put those sinful desires to death, and that is extremely difficult. That's the language of an execution or of a murder, and there's a whole part of us that doesn't want that to happen. It reminds me of the old story of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's a great story. It's a horrible book, but it's a great story. It's been a while since I've read it, but Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in that book, it's about these two guys who go out for a walk, and one says to the other, "Did you hear what happened in that house over there? It's a really wild story. Let me tell you about it." And that's all the action that happens in the first 3 chapters, which is why I say it's a horrible book. They're full-length chapters and everything. The story we know as Dr. Jekyll and Hyde actually happens in the 4th chapter when the guy actually gets around to telling the story of the story. And for me, at least, it's a beautiful story. And it's a story that really speaks to my life of living in this tension between being made in God's image and being inclined towards sinful living, in being on earth and being made for heaven, of being inclined to the values of the earth, while it's when I live by heaven's values that I thrive. This fighting of the two natures, Dr. Jekyll, who's the person I want to be, the person I'm meant to be, the person I'm made to be, and Mr. Hyde, that destructive force inside of me that ruins things and wants to sin. This fighting is hard, and living out our faith is super difficult. And sometimes I feel like I'm at this church, so there's someone who can sympathize with you in the difficulty, and someone who can look at and say, well, if God can use that guy, he really can use anybody. And the final tidbit I have for us today comes from the next chapter in Hebrews 12. At the end of chapter 11, the Hall of Faith wraps up. And at the beginning of 12, the writer says, "Therefore, since we have such a great cloud of witnesses," and those witnesses are everyone he's just written about in the Hall of Faith. And by witnessing, he doesn't mean onlooking, he means testifying. "Since we have such a great cloud of witnesses, let us rid ourselves of every obstacle and the sin which so easily entangles us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us." So we just kind of talked about this. Throw off everything in our way, get it out of the way, put it to death, sacrifice it for the goal. And then he picking up again in chapter 12. "Looking only at Jesus, the originator and the perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart." Keep our eyes fixed on Jesus. You know, Jesus, he's shown us the way. We are not on this journey alone. Jesus is our guide. He is our example to look to and to follow. He has shown us how to do it. And if we keep our eyes focused on him and stay in his word and spend time with him in prayer and learn his values and imbibe his values, that amnesia will start to fade. And we'll find that we have our eyes, our gaze fixed on that distant horizon and be living for the unseen world. Let's go ahead and pray. Lord, I just thank you today for this wonderful passage. Hebrews 11, there's no way we could ever scale this mountain today. We thank you just for what your word says about us, and that you yourself are our focus, that we can focus on you and see the way to live, that we can listen to your voice and learn how to thrive. I just pray that you would help us, because the journey is hard and it's so difficult. Be with us today.
Would you please stand as we sing the closing song together? Is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. I dare not trust the sweetest frame, but wholly lean on Jesus' name. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand. Sing it out. When darkness veils his lovely face, I rest on his unchanging grace. In every high and stormy gale, my anchor holds within the veil. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand. His oath, his covenant, his blood support me in the whelming flood. When all around my soul gives way, he then is all my hope and stay. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand, all come with trumpet sound. Oh, may I then in him be found, dressed in his righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand. On Christ the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand, all other ground is sinking sand. Thank you so much for worshiping with us at Summit Church. God bless your week.